y'all doing? Another beautiful Vermont day. Brought the weather here from Wales, but we can't really say that because it's been raining all summer. So thank you all for coming. My name's John Erickson. I'm part of the faculty of the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources and also a fellow at the Gund Institute for Environment. So welcome, everyone. My job is just to do a quick welcome and move things along here. I want to start with some thank yous. First, thank you to Walt Pullman and Chris Brooks for bringing their class here and our 1010. Where's NR 1010? Right. All right. Thank you so much, you all, for coming out for today's event. I also want to thank Cree Linelac from the Linelac Foundation, who's here. Cree, raise your hand. This would not be possible, as many things in Vermont would not be possible without the Linelac Foundation. The Linelac Foundation has sponsored a climate science seminar, and this is part of that. We're trying to use the seminar to actually connect climate science and climate policy to state initiatives, and this is a great example of that, of how do we connect climate research to climate action. So thank you so much to Cree for making this happen. We also have, we were able to leverage the support from the Linelac Foundation to get co-sponsorships from the Gund Institute for Environment. Our director, Taylor Ricketts, is here. Taylor, thank you so much. We also have the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources is a co-sponsor of the event. I believe our Dean, Alan Strong, is out birding right now on the lake, on the Melisira, but we'll excuse him for that. This is also an event that's been made possible by the Vermont Prosperity Project. This is a big new initiative, a network of networks, if you will, to bring about these kinds of concepts and bring them to our state and make sure that they've got some legs. So the Prosperity Project includes the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, and we have our director, Ellen Kahlers, here from the Jobs Fund. Abundant Sun, Jude and Roland Rakelli, who are joining us online on our Teams channel to this site. We also have the Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility, Roxanne Voigt. Is Roxanne here? I didn't see Roxanne. Roxanne, I think, is joining us online as well. Steph Yu, did I see Steph? Steph is part of the steering wheel of this initiative from the Public Assets Institute. Will Aberly from Recovery Vermont. Jessica Savage from Vermont Council on Rural Development. And Amanda Janot from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. These are groups that are steering this new effort that you're going to hear a lot more about in the coming months and years, the Vermont Prosperity Project. Amanda, who is really responsible for bringing Sophie here today, is going to come up and do a quick introduction. Amanda grew up in Vermont. Then she was out in the world working in United Nations circles, studying abroad, doing all kinds of great work around bringing this idea of well-being to fruition. And we are so lucky that she's now found her way back to Vermont and is the economics and policy lead to what's called WEALL, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which you want to talk about networks of networks. This is a network all around the world of big countries that are trying to move the dial and move away from things like gross domestic product and away from the narrative of if we only grew the economy bigger, we'd be better, to a different kind of story that really questions growth, who benefits from growth, what's the purpose of growth, and how long can we grow? And that's the context of this work that we're doing here in Vermont, the Vermont Prosperity Project, the UVM Climate Science Seminar Series, and our speaker today. So without further ado, I want to invite Amanda up, who will introduce our special guest from Wales. Thank you. Amanda.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So I've always been an optimist, maybe even a bit of an idealist. I've always believed in the good of people and our capacity to save the world, but I must be honest that a few years ago that optimism definitely wavered when I was reading this UN report that was projecting an environmental apocalypse by 2040 at the same time that there was a report that was speaking about at least 10,000 species becoming extinct every year. And for the first time, I thought, well, shit, if we're all gonna die, right? Like, might as well just enjoy myself at this point. And it was a fleeting thought, but it was a really powerful one, because this phenomena is what psychologists are calling eco-anxiety, and I think maybe many of us can very much relate to this symptom or feeling of this ominous kind of reality of climate change, leaving us feeling really powerlessness and unable to improve the situation. And so I experienced that sort of paralyzing nihilism that so many of us today are experiencing as we watch the world burn, but also realize we can't grow our way and consume our way out of this one. But I think there's also some hope to be found in that realization, because once we realize that climate change is not an existential threat, but actually a very clear result of our unjust and unsustainable economic system, then I think we realize that we have the capacity to redesign the economy so that it is actually regenerative by design, so that it protects and cherishes our natural world. And so in this time of uncertainty and crisis, people around the world are calling for change. So the majority of people worldwide now believe that capitalism is doing more harm than good. And even in our own country, the US, which we might say is one of the most hardcore sort of free market economies in the world, 68% of people believe that the economy should be working in a way that supports the health and well-being of people and planet rather than narrowly focusing on profit and wealth. And this is really at the heart of the well-being economy movement. It's about this recognition that we have to stop treating people and planet like they're here to serve the economy and start treating the economy like it's here to serve us. And so this movement comes under a lot of different banners like ecological economics, regenerative development, solidarity economy, business for the common good, and many more. But they're all sort of a foundation for the well-being economy movement and my sort of finding my dream job at We All, where I get to work with organizations, academics, governments, and change makers around the world to really build the mass movement needed to shift our economic paradigm and system. And I think this movement is all about reminding us that we are the economy, and therefore we have the power to change it. And we're really seeing governments starting to heed this call. Most notably, I think the Wellbeing Economy governments, or WeGo, are currently comprised of New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, Scotland, Wales, and Canada. And they have all committed to transforming their economic systems so that they work in service of people and planet's well-being. But one of my favorite, I would say, examples from WeGo is Wales, because they have really realized that it's not just about different indicators of progress or trying to find the perfect alternative economic model, that this is really about a reform in democracy and governance and the types of systems and thinking that animate our decision-making within the political sphere. And so it was for this reason that the Vermont Prosperity Project brought Sophie Howe to come to Vermont to meet with legislators and government officials yesterday at the State House to start to seed these ideas in Vermont and in the United States. Because Sophie Howe, it was the world's first described as by The Guardian, Minister of the Future, or the Future Generations Commissioner. And she has been able to witness the transformative power of this legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. But she's also really acutely aware of the types of challenges that exist in this sort of transformative initiative. As prior to becoming the Wales Future Generations Commissioner, she was elected as the youngest city councillor ever in Wales at 21. And she's worked as a special political advisor to 2 different First Ministers around issues of community engagement, housing, equity, safety, and regeneration. During her tenure as the Wales Future Generations Commissioner from 2016 to 2023, Sophie has embraced her responsibility as the guardian of future generations and has promoted broad-based public involvement, preventative action, and cross-collaboration across government. She's been a champion of universal basic income, of really supporting the transition towards a circular and regenerative economy in Wales, and really identifying the root causes of the crises we face today. And we're seeing governments around the world really being inspired by this Wales legislation and starting to follow suit with protecting the rights of future generations and of nature in order to ensure that we have all of us are able to not only thrive, but survive the years ahead. And so Sophie is not only an incredibly warm and inspiring speaker, but she's amazingly humble and down to earth, despite being listed as the BBC's top 5 power list, and also featured in the list of 25 women changing the world. And so it's my absolute honor to introduce Sophie Howe during this Climate Week, as I believe that urgency is not enough. We also need hope to inspire action. And so in this time of growing critique of our contemporary political and economic systems, Wales Future Generations Act stands as a vision of hope that a different system is not only possible, but already underway. So please join me in a warm welcome for Sophie Howe.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda. Diolch yn fawr. That's a bit of Welsh. I can say bore da to you, and you can say bore da back to me. Anyone? Bore da, da iawn ti. So that means good morning in Welsh. So you didn't know you were going to learn a bit of Welsh as well today. So it's my absolute pleasure to be with you this morning and to have spent some time with state legislators, politicians in the State House yesterday discussing this, well, exploring the potential for a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act for Vermont. I'm going to start with this picture. This is one of my own future generations. This is my little girl, Belle. She is 9 now. She was about 6 here, I think. And for me, this picture sums up how I would like our future generations to grow up. So she's happy, she's thriving, she's connected with nature. And I think really that's a vision perhaps that we can all get behind, whether that's for our own children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, or those in our community, or indeed those across the world. Now, a lot of people ask me, you know, what on earth is a Future Generations Commissioner? And that's absolutely fine. I was the world's first Future Generations Commissioner. It can be quite lonely being out there on my own. So part of my mission now, as I've finished, is to find some more friends for the next Future Generations Commissioner. So perhaps we can, is that not working? There we are. Perhaps, you know, we can see other countries adopting this. A Future Generations Commissioner is not really someone who is psychic and can predict the future, absolutely. And in fact, although we have these people called futurists who specialise in looking at future trends, scenarios, foresighting techniques and so on, they don't often get things absolutely right. Of course, that's impossible. What they do tend to look at and you know, often identify signals for the future that we should be taking into account. You know, they bring to the fore the long-term trends, which are often ignored. I'll give you an example of some things that futurists or philanthropists who were trying to predict the future 100 years ago from now in 1923. So some quite interesting things here. So they predicted curls for men. Men would be wearing curls, they said. We should worry, apparently, because women will be shaving their heads. But it's okay because there will be no more hard work. By 2023, we'll only be working a 4-hour day owing to the work of electricity. And perhaps that's got something to do with this massive increase in life expectancy. So we'll be living, the average year of people in 2023 will be 100 years, and in some cases could be up to 200 years. And maybe that's something to do with the utensils made from pulp. Maybe that has some health benefits that we don't know about. So these are kind of, you know, they're quite amusing in a way. And obviously they haven't quite panned out. I'm not sure if any of you are intending to live to 200 years. Maybe you will. But actually, there are quite a number of signals here for the way in which the world is constructed in 2023. So we're all living longer, although actually, interestingly, in some countries, including the UK, life expectancy is plateauing. We're thinking in a completely different way about gender and identity. We've recently seen the biggest trial, global trial of reduced working week, which was really successful. I implemented this in my own organisation. the equivalent of a 4-day working week, however you might want to work that. Most of the companies involved in that trial saw their productivity remain the same or increase. If you think about it, you know, thinking about that in a different way, we've been working a 37-hour week for the last 100 years, and yet the world of work has exponentially changed. Technology has completely transformed the way that we do things. So why are we all still working 37 hours? Perhaps we're ending our love affair with plastic. In Wales, for example, we are about to legislate to ban the use of single-use plastic. So what does the world, however, look like in 2023 in terms of how that might play out for the next 100 years? What are the things that we need to be considering now and actually taking action on? Well, we have huge technological advancements, so automation, AI, artificial intelligence, things that are so disruptive we can't quite conceive. So, you know, this year's mega disruption has been ChatGPT. You know, that has the potential to transform things in a positive way, but also has quite a kind of darker side in terms of the way that that could play out. Of course, environmental disaster. I know here you've experienced horrendous flooding, and that's a consequence, of course, of the damage that we've done to our planet. But how is that going to play out in the future? And an aging population. It's a really good thing that we are all living longer, but actually that has some really fundamental implications for public policy. How are we going to meet the costs of an aging population? Who is going to provide and pay for care? What are we doing now to ensure that our aging population, as Mr. Spock says, should live long and prosper rather than live long and have high care needs and low quality of life? Those are things that we need to tackle now to prevent problems from occurring in the future. And the problem is that we are really, really bad at thinking for the long term. We're really bad at identifying and responding. Even when we've identified, we're really bad at responding in terms of the policy interventions that we need. We're also really bad at joining the dots. If we just look at these three megatrends, the way in which they intersect present even more potential opportunities and or challenges. So if we look at climate threat, for example, climate threat is going to be most acute to those people who are most vulnerable. Our ageing population tend to be those who are in the most vulnerable category. So you bring those two things together, how is that going to intersect? One of the other major global trends is around increasing mistrust in democracy, breakdown of democracy, polarization in society. When I talked about that kind of dark side of ChatGPT, misinformation and disinformation, you know, it used to be that, you know, if you were inclined to check out facts and, you know, fact check for reality, that you could probably do that reasonably easy with a bit of a Google search. ChatGPT now, in a matter of seconds, can place hundreds, if not thousands, of articles supporting mis and disinformation. So it becomes almost impossible for us to check what is real. Deep fakes. So it looks like I might be saying, actually, I'm Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, and I think we should continue polluting the planet, and look like absolutely I am saying that. So some real challenges there in terms of the things that are facing us, and none of us are on top of any of these challenges. I'm not saying none of us in this room. I reckon probably the people in this room are far more on top or thinking about these things than perhaps some of our world leaders are themselves. And we've only got to look really at the kind of global risk registers to show how bad this situation is. So this is the global risk register in 2012 compared to 2022. And you'll see all of the things that we're experiencing now predicted back as global risks more than 10 years ago. So severe income disparity, check, yep, that's happened. We've got that. Chronic fiscal imbalances, yep. Rising greenhouse gases, water supply crises, mismanagement of population and ageing, and they're featuring again in the global risk registers that we've got in 2023, which means we haven't really done anything to mitigate that. Just on that issue of wealth inequality, we can see here these disparities. We can see that our economic system, as Amanda says, it's not working for us. We are working for the economic system, and the economic system works for a tiny number of people who derive profit and wealth at the cost of the masses and indeed at the cost of the planet. Now, I'm quite into a bit of hip-hop. I don't know about you, but I would recommend this guy. This is a British hip-hop artist called Loyal Kana, and to me, he hits the nail on the head. He says, never has so much been lost by so many because of the inaction of so few. Amanda also played for me on the way in today something called The Kids by Soul. It's a little bit more fruity, so I couldn't quote from that one, but I would recommend you listen to that one too. So essentially, what we have created is this instability. If we look 50,000 years to the past, there have been about 100 billion people who've been alive on planet Earth and who are now dead. At the moment, well, we've got 7.7 billion there. This is a little bit out of date. Actually, the world hit the 8 billion mark in terms of population last year. But if we look 50,000 years to the future, on the basis of current population estimations, there are about 6.75 trillion people yet to be born. And everything that I've just described to you there has basically meant that the world is unstable for 6.75 trillion people who are yet to be born. So what do we do about that? How do we shift a system or to a system which does away with the problems that we're causing at the moment, which thinks long-term and which supports the well-being of future generations. Now, the good news is that there are a number of countries entering into this space. So here are the flags of a few of them. Now, a bit of audience participation. How many of you could name all of these flags? Put your hands up. All of them? Yeah, you're pretty good go? I promise I won't pick on you, but you have to be honest. Okay, how many of you could name half of them? Yeah, I reckon that's about half of you. So, some of the countries that we have here, we've got Bhutan, who has a gross national happiness index. That's the less wonderful of the dragon flags. The best flag on this screen is this dragon one here. This is the Welsh flag. We've got New Zealand, we've got Canada, we've got Australia, we've got the United Nations. Some that are a bit kind of, ooh, why are they there? The UAE, some moving in some ways in a direction towards well-being. I wouldn't say they are anywhere near a well-being economy, but they do have a happiness strategy. The Cayman Islands, starting thinking about a Future Generations Act, Gibraltar, Scotland, and so on. So, okay, so you did a reasonable-ish job at naming some of these flags. What about these? Who can name all of these? It's pretty much all of you. Yeah. Okay. What about these? Now, this experiment is less effective with this audience, who are, of course, people who have probably been studying all of these. But actually, there was a study of American children, okay, which found that American children could identify up to 1,000 corporate logos, but couldn't identify 10 plants and animals native to their hometown or community. And that is the society that we have created. This is the kind of the world, the legacy that we are leaving behind to future generations. Are we surprised, therefore, that we are very much, as a society, in a position where we view ourselves as global consumers and not as global citizens? Not all of us, of course, but this is the society that our systems have created. So we are trying to change that through a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. This Act was passed in Wales in 2015. It was passed following a national dialogue with the citizens of Wales, where we posed the question, what is the Wales you want to leave behind to your children, your grandchildren, and future generations to come? And these are some of the things that citizens told us. I want a Wales where every child has a healthy, tasty food every day. We have just done that. We have universal free school meals in Wales tied up to a sustainable food supply chain. It's not perfect, but we're working that through. I want a Wales where everyone cares about the planet. I'll give you some more information about that. Essentially, what citizens told us was transformed into this Future Generations Act with this overarching principle which says, set out in law, applies to all 44 of our main public institutions. So that's all of our local government institutions, our health boards who run and manage our national healthcare system, our Environment Agency, our Public Health Agency, our Arts Council, all of our main institutions, but significantly the Welsh Government itself. They must demonstrate how they take decisions in a way which meets today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And it then sets out these 7 long-term wellbeing goals based on what the citizens of Wales told us. We also looked at, we were lucky, I suppose, at the time the UN Sustainable Development Goals were in development. We looked at what was happening globally. We looked at what people of Wales said mattered to them, and we came up with these 7 long-term wellbeing goals. Now, there are a few really interesting things about these goals. I don't know how well you can read the definitions up there on the screen. I'm going to pull out the definition of a prosperous Wales. Can anyone tell me what's not included in it that you might expect to see in a definition of prosperity? Anyone? Money. GDP. No reference to GDP. So this definition of prosperity in Wales, an innovative, productive and low-carbon society which recognises the limits of the global environment and therefore uses resources efficiently and proportionately, including acting on climate change, and which develops a skilled and well-educated population in an economy which generates wealth and provides employment opportunities, allowing people to take advantage of the wealth generated through securing decent work. A long, long definition. But if you pull out the kind of key aspects of that, it's basically about prosperity being set within planetary boundaries, efficient use of resources, giving people access to decent work, not just any old work. So this is really taking Wales off in a direction towards a well-being economy rather than an economy whose whole purpose is growth, growth, growth. And the duties on all of the public bodies covered by this Act are to set objectives which maximise their contribution to all 7 of the wellbeing goals. And that's the next sort of game changer, if you like, in this legislation, because it's basically requiring all of our institutions to work beyond their boundaries. It's saying that what we might have traditionally done is, right, we've got this goal for a healthier Wales, we've got a National Health Service, there you go, NHS, you deliver that goal of a healthier Wales, which sort of sounds sensible, except both our National Health Service quite different to the way that you deliver health, but there are parallels. Essentially, it's not a National Health Service, it's a National Illness Service. And your healthcare system is also an illness system. It intervenes at the point that you become ill, you need treatment or what have you. It does not focus on the things that actually keep you well in the first place. And the things that keep you well in the first place are actually very little to do with the healthcare system. If you look at this from the World Health Organization, this is showing the reasons for the differences in life expectancy. So are you going to live to a ripe old age? Some people do. And then what are the reasons that other people die younger? Well, here are the reasons. So first off, what accounts for the difference in terms of 10%? Only 10% of the difference is the healthcare system. So we are spending trillions and trillions of pounds and dollars on a healthcare system which only actually makes 10% of the difference to how long we live. The biggest difference is about income security and social protection. So quite literally, poverty kills. If you are living in poverty, the number of years that you will live will be drastically reduced as compared to those people who are not living in poverty. Can you put food on the table, and so on. 29% is about our living conditions. What's the quality of your housing? Are you living in areas of high air pollution? Do you have access to nature? Is your community safe? 19% is about social and human capital. So what's the quality of your relationships? Do you have people you're connected to and can turn to, say, in an hour of need? Is there a sense of community in the area that you live, and do you have agency in that community? Now, when we talk about well-being in public policy, I was on the telly in one of these sort of chat shows in Australia recently, and the host said, "Isn't this all a bit like woohoo?" And, you know, I often get the kind of the yoga beads thing. Are you all going to be, you know, just sort of being a bit zen and so on? Is this what it's all about? If you think that this is all soft and fluffy, social and human capital, quality of life, living conditions and so on, this relates back to the hard metrics of how long are you going to live. So if it's not a role of government and public policy to focus on that, on those determinants, I don't know what their role actually is. The other big thing about this legislation and back to these goals is that essentially it sets a vision for the Wales that we want to leave behind. Now, you wouldn't think it was revolutionary for a country to have a long-term vision, but it's completely revolutionary. There is no other country in the world that has a long-term vision set out in law. And there's the problem, isn't it? Because most countries don't really know where they're going. Someone described to me a little while ago around using maps on your iPhone, for example. If you want to go somewhere, you're going to put, you know, the postcode or the address or what have you in maps. And maps will take you on the quickest route, or if there's a diversion, if there's congestion, if there's a range of different things, it's going to reroute you, and it's eventually going to get you to where you're going. Essentially, our systems of politics and governance, they don't have a destination. We're just kind of going round and round in circles. They don't actually know where it is we're going. So how do they make sure that all of the things they're doing is adding up to something positive, to a vision, to something which is we want to see in the future? And I really like this Alvin Toffler quote, which says you've got to think about the big things while you're doing the small things, so that all the small things go in the right direction. And that's essentially it. This is the system that we are trying to create in Wales. We're saying everything that we do across government, across all of our public services, must be designed to take us towards those wellbeing goals. Now, there's another part of this, which is these 5 principles by which our institutions must work. So, they must recognise, they must consider the long-term impact of the things they do. So how might this play out in 25 years' time? They must also look at the potential things that could take us off course. So a bit like the use of your maps, you know, what are the things that could divert us away from reaching our wellbeing goals? And we should try and avoid those. Back to this point on prevention, we should aim to prevent problems from occurring or from getting worse. Or what are the trends and scenarios or things that might occur that actually we might want to grasp because they're going to accelerate progress towards meeting those goals? So having that long-term thinking, using foresight in future trends techniques, and aiming to prevent problems from occurring or getting worse, the first 2 principles. The next principle, integration. So this is the point that I was making about our healthcare system. Our governments and our systems are just intrinsically kind of siloed. They don't join things up. And everything is connected to everything. So actually, back to that graph, if we're thinking about health and the things that are going to make a difference to health, actually, public health is a transport function. Why do I say that? Because transport, if we just build it all around cars, we're going to increase air pollution. We're not going to get people physically active. We're not going to create those connected communities because we're all sat in traffic in cars. So thinking about transport as actually a public health intervention is the way that we need to be thinking differently about things. And you can play that out across the board. Across all policy areas, there are connections everywhere. The final two principles, collaboration, so a requirement for all of our public institutions to work together because no one public institution can deal with any of these challenges on their own, and the legislation establishes specific mechanisms for that, something called public services boards, which are a culmination of all the key public services in each area, who have to do a long-term assessment of the issues in their area and then set a collective wellbeing plan to address them. And then finally, involvement, so involving people in decision-making. You know, we've often, and I'm sure many of you in this room will be experts in a particular field, and absolutely we need experts to bring evidence, data, you know, solutions and so on. But we also need to recognise that people are their own experts. People are experts in their lives. They are the people who live in communities. They are the people who know the problems with this, that and the other, or how they could be solved. So we need that principle of involvement. We often talk about kind of hard data and hard measures and how are things changing, how are the metrics moving, and so on. But actually, people's stories are kind of data with soul, if you like. So we need to not strip that away, and we need to embed that in our systems. So those 5 principles were described when the minister who took this legislation through, finally, he described the Act as the Common Sense Act, really because of those 5 principles. Because if you stripped away all of your governance frameworks and your decision-making frameworks and this, that and the other, actually, if you just applied those 5 principles to everything that you do, you know, throughout life, in terms of how decisions are taken in this university, in terms of how the First Minister or the Prime Minister or the President or whoever it might be takes decisions, they are inherently common sense. So why have we legislated for common sense? It's because in public policy, common sense is not at all common. I am wondering if it will ever make a comeback. The final thing that the Future Generations Act does is establish a Future Generations Commissioner. So someone who is appointed independently of government with a role set out in law to be the guardian of the interests of the future generations of Wales. So no pressure there or anything. That was my job for the last 7 years. The unborn at some point will tell you how well I did at that. But this is essentially, my role was to almost be the conscience of future generations. So here are some of the things, how that role kind of panned out. So powers to advise and support public institutions on the steps that they should take, propose new and progressive ideas of the sorts of policies that they could put in place to reach those wellbeing goals, help and support them to change their systems in terms of how they're doing that, but also monitor and assessing how well they were doing, looking at what progress they were making, unpicking systems of old, because if you imagine we've passed this progressive legislation, but like everything that's come before it, at best is not aligned and at worst is completely in conflict with what we're trying to do here. So lots of kind of, you know, support and advising, and often challenging, quite publicly challenging and asking the government and other institutions to show me their workings. Show me how when you've taken this decision or you're about to take this decision, you have applied these principles. So what has changed as a result of that? Well, I suppose the first big test of the legislation was exactly that scenario. The government had plans to spend the entire of their borrowing capacity, so upwards of £1.5 billion, on building a 13-mile stretch of motorway, freeway, to deal with the problem of congestion around one of our main cities. And I intervened in that issue and essentially asked the government to show me their workings out, show me how they'd applied the Future Generations Act to that issue. Oh, what's happened here? Hang on. Let's go back there. So here's the motorway. It's congested. I asked them to explain to me how they'd considered the long term there. What will future mobility needs look like? What happens when we build roads? Well, actually, the international evidence tells us that when we build more roads, quite quickly we fill them again. So are we preventing that problem from occurring again, or are we just storing in the longer term that problem up for the future? they couldn't show me how they'd properly applied that analysis. I then asked them to show me how they considered the integration of each of the 7 wellbeing goals. So I asked them how they'd considered the goal of a prosperous Wales, productive, innovative, low-carbon society, one which uses resources efficiently and proportionately, including acting on climate change, because when you build roads, you increase your carbon emissions. So how is that in line with that goal? Also, how is it in line with the goal of a resilient Wales, which is about enhancing, maintaining, restoring ecosystems? The picture here on the left is the Gwent levels, the top left. This was a site of special scientific interest, described as the Welsh Amazon, and the road was going to go through the Gwent levels. How is this in line with that goal? Can you also explain to me how it's in line with the goal of a healthier Wales? Because we have illegal levels of air pollution, we have increasing rates of obesity, so getting everyone sat in their cars, how is that making a positive contribution? And then finally, can you explain to me how it's in line with the goal of a more equal Wales, because 25% of the lowest income families in this region don't own a car because they can't afford one. So are you saying you're going to spend the entire of the government's borrowing capacity on an infrastructure scheme which benefits the already better off and does nothing for the poorest in our society, reaching that goal of a more equal Wales? So to cut a long story short, the government had difficulty explaining that publicly to the Future Generations Commissioner, and they changed their minds. They cancelled the road building scheme. They set up a commission to look at the alternatives with the terms of reference set around how would we deal with a problem like congestion through the lens of the Future Generations Act. And here's a really interesting kind of model that we like to use for this. So this is called the 3 Horizons model. So Horizon 1 is basically looking at, this is kind of where we are at the moment, business as usual, if you like. And in many cases, business as usual is taking us off in a downward trajectory. It's taking us off into negative things. Where is it that we want to be? We want to be in Horizon 3, the green line. Now, and here's the kind of, you know, the magic in Wales. We know where we want to be. I don't know whether you guys know where you want to be. There's nothing set out in law which says you know where you want to be. There's nothing that's set out in law that says any country, other country knows where we want to be. But that is where we're heading for. We're heading for delivery of these 7 integrated wellbeing goals. Now, Horizon 2 is like, what are the kind of things that we therefore need to do to get us towards those 7 wellbeing goals? What are the policy interventions we need to put in place? Perhaps what's the technology, and so on and so on. And you can see there that there are 2 ways that that can go. You can have a Horizon 2 which is negative, which actually seems like a good thing to do, but when you test it, it actually takes you back to business as usual. What we want are the positive Horizon 2s, which are going to take us towards this new normal. So if I play this out in terms of that kind of transport argument, if you started with a proposition of how do we decarbonise our transportation system, it's something which every place in the world generally is grappling with. Quite a sensible intervention to decarbonise a transportation system is mass investment in electric vehicles. So we're going to roll out EV infrastructure, we're going to make EVs cheaper, we might give grants for people to buy EVs and so on. And that would mean that the cars that we have on our roads are not producing emissions. There's lots of issues with the emissions that are in the batteries and building them and so on and so on. If, however, your mission is to decarbonise your transportation system, whilst also improving health, whilst also building cohesive communities, whilst also making your country more equal, actually investing in EV infrastructure is not the answer at all, because we're all still sat in traffic, not talking to each other, in our EVs rather than our diesel vehicles. We haven't walked anywhere. We've got in our cars on our drives and driven off somewhere, so we're not connecting with people in our community. If you couldn't afford a diesel car, you're not going to be able to afford an electric car, so we're still not addressing that inequity. So whilst it seems like a kind of positive intervention, actually it's just taking us back to business as usual. What we're trying to do here is to be completely transformational. And that issue in Wales, that one issue initially of the motorway, actually led to a whole transformation of our transport strategy. So a new strategy which puts walking, cycling, at the top of the transport hierarchy, because walking and cycling gives you biggest bang for your buck against those wellbeing goals, followed by public transport, followed by EVs, and then right at the bottom of the transport hierarchy. So this is kind of how we take decisions. We prioritise active travel. I intervened with the government and asked them to show me how all of their pre-approved road building schemes had considered the Future Generations Act, and again they struggled. So we reviewed 55 of them already approved, about to be built. 51 of them have now been cancelled. We shifted the money that we were going to spend on building roads into public transport and active travel interventions. We are increasing the infrastructure around that, and just this weekend, just past, Wales has rolled out a 20-mile-an-hour blanket speed limit reduced from 30 miles an hour across all Wales's roads, because what we're seeking to do is to reprioritise people, communities over car use, because when you do that, you get this biggest bang for your buck on wellbeing. What else has happened? That connection and that requirement to collaborate and think beyond your immediate remit has led to some really interesting things popping up. So in Cardiff, our capital city, a public health consultant was seconded into the council to lead on the development of the city's transportation strategy. And when you apply a public health lens to a transport problem, you get a completely different set of solutions, because what he looked at is back to those determinants of health. Where are the areas with the high air pollution? Where are the areas with the lowest levels of life expectancy? And how can we target our public transport or our transport interventions in those areas? So there are a range of things that are happening there, more buses, more cycle lanes and so on. Even doctors in Cardiff, you might go to them because you've got high cholesterol, you've got mental health issues, you're on the edge of diabetes. Physical activity is really good for all of those conditions. So why shouldn't a doctor be able to issue a prescription for free bike hire as well as a prescription for statins? This is about thinking in a transformational way and joining the dots. If we also think about our healthcare system, if the healthcare system globally was a country, it would be the 5th biggest emitter of carbon in the world. So on the one hand, we've got this system which is supposed to be keeping us well. On the other hand, we've got this system which is causing the things that are going to make us ill in the first place, if you believe most of the climate scientists and public health professionals. So actually our healthcare system, as much as they have a role to deliver healthcare, they also have a role in decarbonising. So an example here of how that's happening in Wales, the first hospital-based solar farm in one of our cities called Swansea, which is actually reducing their carbon emissions and generating them an income which they can put back into frontline public services. Here again, an example of us trying to get to the root causes of issues. So that metric's around 35% of what makes a difference to your life expectancy being about income security and poverty. And our social security system was designed when the gig economy wasn't a thing, when zero-hour contracts weren't a thing, when we didn't have the huge mental health challenges and trajectory that we are seeing, and so on, when we didn't understand the connection between poverty and health. And it is no longer fit for purpose. So a universal basic income may be part of the solution to that. So just a few years ago, it was seen as completely impossible. We cannot, it's too expensive. How are we going to do it? Last year saw the first UK government-backed pilot of a basic income in Wales, initially targeting young people who've been in foster care or are leaving the state care system, who have £1,600 a month, no strings attached, and we are wrapping a massive evaluation around that to see what the wellbeing benefits to those that group are. Now, all of this is exciting stuff, exciting kind of policy initiatives, but really this is about the system change which sits beneath this, because the problem with initiatives, and we see them all over the world, there's exciting things happening all over the world, actually, they're often isolated because the system that they're operating within is still rotten and we haven't done that reform. So what we are trying to do here in Wales is deal with the symptoms of a failed system by changing some of these policies, whilst also trying to reform the system itself. And this is what the system is increasingly looking like. This is the world we're operating in, this word VUCA. We are operating in a VUCA environment, an environment which is volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. And if you think about how our public servants, our politicians have grown up, they haven't grown up in this sort of environment. They're conditioned to work in the short term, they're conditioned to protect their department and their budget. They don't have that kind of systems thinking or that helicopter view and so on. They're conditioned to deliver in the short term. But this is where we need to sort of transform the system, which is essentially what we're trying to do in Wales. Now, I started with some grass that my little girl was playing in, and this is a much more beleaguered version of grass. This is my backyard, which I think represents the system we're operating in. Now, my backyard has 4 boys playing soccer on it. It's got 2 dogs running around on it. There's like a man cave at the back of it where teenagers sort of troop down regularly, and I haven't really nurtured it, if I'm honest. And that kind of hard ground represents the system that we are working within, the system and how it needs to change. If you think about a lot of our public servants and our politicians, they're really beleaguered. They're dealing with polycrisis, one after another, and often overlaying each other. They're responding to crises all the time. They're not spending time nurturing and changing the system. If you think about some of these people within the system who are trying to do different and better things, these green shoots, if you like, it's really, they might be able to do different and better things in their little area, but actually joining the dots, making a whole lawn of luscious grass is really, really difficult because the system, the ground underneath is not supporting that. So essentially what we're trying to do is to nurture the soil. We're trying to nurture the foundations of a system and transform it in a way which is going to enable that grass to grow in a much better way. Now, within the system, there are a few types of people. There are people who are waiting to see what happens. These are what I call the kind of passive procrastinators. They're kind of like, it's all a bit big, it's all a bit difficult for us. We'll wait and see what other people do first. And, you know, also we're kind of a small country. We can't really do that much, so we're just gonna sit back. There are also the frustrated champions. So these are people who are responsible for those green shoots on my grass or in the system, if you like. These are people who can see for a long time that there's been a better way of doing things, but the system has frustrated them. They might break through the system, but then they're trying to join the dots between everything else, and they're being asked about, where's your short-term performance measures? No, you can't spend budgets in a preventative way because I want to see returns delivered this year, and so on and so on. These are the most critical people in the system. If you're going to reform it, you need to find these frustrated champions and you need to support them. And that's exactly what has happened in Wales. The Future Generations Act gives them permission to challenge the system. It supports those frustrated champions. System is full of these people, the abominable no men, right? These are the people who will tell you it's not possible, we need to retain business as usual. Sometimes we see those people quite often we see those people in politics and governance, often we see those people in corporates. And the Future Generations Act does not apply to business because of the devolved competency of the Welsh Government. And I think it's quite interesting, actually, when, I don't know if any of you know what I mean when I describe a grief curve. So a grief curve, imagine if you've lost someone or something has happened. A grief curve, you start off with not believing. And you go in, it's nothing, it hasn't happened, it's not here. Now, this is where our private sector started on this grief curve. We're not covered by it. We don't need to bother with it. It's nothing to do with us. We're just going to carry on doing the stuff that we need to do. Then what started happening is suddenly through public procurement, contracts that were coming for government, the government was asking, you need to show us, construction sector, whatever sector you might be, how you're applying the Future Generations Act, or how you're going to help us to deliver the Future Generations Act. Then we saw things like cancelling roads. My God, they said, this is all changing. This is all a bit too fast. So the next part of the grief curve is shock and non-acceptance. Absolutely not. That futures woman is a pain in the backside. Who on earth thought it was a good idea to legislate to protect the interests of future generations, and what can we possibly do about it? And then the next part of the grief curve is you start accepting. And you start realising that things are going to change, and they might not change back to where it was before. In fact, they certainly won't. But actually, there are some things that can, that can be better, and you move on. And actually, I think that that's partly what our private sector have been going through, starting from that non-acceptance, and we're not going to engage, towards actually then knocking my door, at least towards the end of my term, they were knocking my door saying, actually, there's something really interesting about this Future Generations Act, because there's nothing the private sector love more than a bit of certainty. They might not necessarily agree initially with the wellbeing goals, although interestingly, most of them do. They say they do. Wellbeing washing, greenwashing, whatever you want to call it. So if you agree with it, if you're saying you agree with it, well, here's the legislation and here's a government who's going to take you in that direction. So they have increasingly got on board with it. They like the certainty of knowing where government is going. It's no surprise that Wales is now the fastest growing region in terms of the number of green jobs that are created in Wales, because the government is taking us off in that trajectory and the private sector are able to respond. And they are increasingly starting to wrap their whole approach around delivering the Future Generations Act. So what I'm going to end with is just saying that none of this is easy. You can have a piece of legislation, which is a really good starting point, but this is not just legislation. It's not just bureaucratic process requirements. This is a big cultural change. This is completely transforming the way that we do business in a country, across all of our institutions, and that needs to happen in every country in the world. Now, Wales is a really small nation, just like Vermont is a small state, but as you heard, we are actually influencing policy on a global scale. So the UN Secretary-General has proposed that there should be a Future Generations Declaration, the appointment of a UN Special Envoy for Future Generations, which is like the UN equivalent of my role. So there we have this tiny nation impacting policy on a global scale. And I think for a state like Vermont, a small state, a progressive state, you have the opportunity, if you seize this, to do something similar, which will start the ball rolling and act as a catalyst for the rest of the US. And you get things changing in the US, and you get things changing across the world. So in the coming months, you will have an election. It's important you participate in that. It's important that you are not a passive procrastinator saying, don't make any difference how I vote. It's important that you challenge your elected representatives in terms of how are they delivering for you as younger generations and those who are coming behind you. And you need to keep challenging that system. Great people have always encountered opposition from mediocre minds, says Einstein. I would add in mediocre systems. So keep going and never believe you are too small to influence change at a global level. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you so much. So we've got some time for some Q&A, and so we'd love to hear from folks, especially this future generations that we're talking about. Are you a passive procrastinist? Sorry, that's a mouthful. Are you a frustrated champion? Are you an abominable no man or woman? We'd like to hear from all three of you. But we're going to pass the mic around, so if you're interested in asking our Future Generations Commissioner a question, please just raise your hand. I'm going to take one mic, and I'm going to tell Rigo to take the other. All right, we've got a question back here, and then Rigo, set up our second question for us while I go way back here. Come on up. Did I see a hand? Yes, here it is. Question number one.
Hi, Ms. Howe. My name is Andrea, and I'm a freshman here. So I found your presentation very interesting, as I'm sure all of us have. I just would like to know, I can't imagine, as probably the world's only Future Generations Commissioner. What would be your biggest hurdle in terms of communicating with your government in Wales? I'm sure that the government must be stubborn, and businesses, as well as older generations. We all tend to be stuck in our ways. So of those three and other factors, what would be the largest hurdle that you've had to tackle?
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. So you've identified, a lot of the big challenges with this. I think that, there's something about the electorate who intrinsically don't like change. So if you can imagine, if I give an example with that road scenario and the 20-mile-an-hour zones that are being rolled out at the moment, that is a brave political, or a set of brave political decisions to move us in the direction of the wellbeing goals, but it's utterly unpopular amongst many people. I would say particularly older generations. There's some interesting dynamics and data which is showing younger people, young men in particular, in the UK, including Wales, are decreasingly even bothering to learn to drive. They want to have those kind of different solutions in terms of public transport and so on. But there's a real tension, isn't there? Even though you have legislation, which requires our politicians to act in the long term, they still have to get elected. And, fortunately, we have a 5-year term. I have no idea how, your politicians work in a 2-year term. It seems crazy to me. But that is a real kind of tension. So it does require legislation. It requires building a movement around that of people who are going to get behind that legislation and the vision that it's trying to deliver. But it also still requires that political bravery. Now, we do have some of those brave politicians in Wales. We have other politicians who are much more cautious. So this is, I think, really building a kind of societal approach to this. I think what's quite interesting with some of that change, I'll give you an example from one of the other things that we've done as part of this transport system is we've started closing schools off to traffic. And the school that my kids go to was one of the first in these pilots. And there was absolute outrage that parents couldn't drive their kids to school. It was all utterly terrible. The media were riling it all up and so on. We're 2 years on now, and last week I really thought about it. I dropped my little girl at the end of the street, and she ran into school, which I would never have done before. When I say I dropped her, I walked her, and she ran into school. There are kids walking, cycling, scooting, skating into school. They're often coming with their parents who are interacting and having that kind of human connection. And then when they're on their way back home, instead of driving to the supermarket to get their stuff, they're stopping off in the local shops because they're walking past them. They're supporting local independence. And nobody is batting an eyelid about it now. In fact, people really rather like it. So you need that political bravery, however, to drive through the initial trauma of change.
Hi, I'm Mary Jane. I'm also a first year. I think most of us are here. I'm curious if you've seen any efforts of focusing on well-being of people in the U.S. and if you have any people in any powerful positions that you have seen take these initiatives and these efforts? Yeah,
thanks, Mary Jane. So I'm going to be brutally honest with you. The conversations that I have in the US generally, I would actually, and I'm not just saying this because I'm here with you, there's been a distinct difference in the conversations that I've had over the last couple of days in Vermont, but generally the conversations I have in the US are very far removed from this, which makes me a bit sad. That's not to say that there aren't, there aren't groups, there aren't non-profits, there aren't philanthropic organisations really kind of agitating in this direction. But I think that, there seems to be, and far be it from me to come from the UK and, tell you about your political system, but there does seem to me to be this it's so difficult and so big to shift. There's interest, I think, from some people in some states, but trying to corral that. I think the only way forward in the US is to scale it down, start smaller and then scale up. And I think often the way in which these things do scale up is that there's some political moment that happens. They're looking to people who might have already had a solution, and then that starts to kind of grow. But you know, I think that there's something, I feel sometimes this almost like lack of hope in people that I speak to from the US, and that makes me really sad. And I think there's got to be a way of turning that around, of giving people hope and optimism. We shouldn't be, you know, so optimistic that, you know, that we relax and say, oh, it's all going to be fine. But we absolutely shouldn't be so pessimistic that we give up. And I think there's something, you know, I'm very cautious about putting all of this on the next generation because you've got enough worries of your own. But there is something about these younger generations sort of rising and demanding something different from their politicians.
Hi, my name's Cassidy. I'm an environmental science major, and I have a bit of a clarifying question first and then possibly a follow-up. I forget, did you mention switching to electric vehicles in your speech? Fantastic. Yes. And as the Future Generations Commissioner, I'm sorry, I forgot your title already, but as someone who's focusing on the future and, you know, switching to electric vehicles, are you also looking for solutions on how to dispose of the lithium-ion batteries and whether the increase in electric vehicle production will boost the lithium mining industry and then all of the environmental repercussions for that?
I think that's a really good and important question, and that's exactly why I'm saying we shouldn't put all of our eggs in an EV basket, because we haven't resolved how we're going to deal with all of that. We're kind of being willfully blind to what our position might be in terms of being globally responsible, who is going to mine the lithium, what are the long-term consequences of all of that. And that's why I'm saying that actually, you know, you can't get away from the fact that, you know, we will need vehicles and probably EV will be part of the solution, but actually saying it should be the entire solution rather than looking at where we can support in better public transit, better opportunities for people to walk and cycle. That should be the prioritisation.
Hi, my name is Jolien. I'm a PhD candidate with Rubenstein. It occurs to me throughout the course of your talk that in both your role as the Commissioner for Future Generations as well as the Chair of Network Institutions for Future Generations, that you served kind of in a network manager type role. And I'm curious that particularly if you could reflect on some of the challenges of coordinating both horizontally within the various governments of Wales as well as vertically between various national governments, or pardon me, the opposite, vertically between the governments of Wales and horizontally between the various national governments. And what strategies you might recommend for addressing various governments that might have different governance contexts from one another. Thank you.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think you're right in terms of, you know, perhaps I would use the word sort of network weaver or what have you. I suppose in terms of, you know, conveying the Welsh model is a model. It won't be appropriate for every country. I think there's something about starting at where people are at. So, for example, some work that I've been doing in Australia, their federal treasurer, their finance minister, has just implemented an approach to wellbeing budgeting. So they're calling it measuring what matters. So they're measuring like beyond GDP. That's a reasonable starting point, but it's not going to take you very far if you're just measuring stuff after the event rather than actually using that to drive policy. But there you've got to go with where the flow and the energy is and then try to influence in a different way. The key thing to that, I think, is building coalitions in those countries. And that was, you know, the same, absolutely the same in Wales. So some of the really interesting stuff in Wales was like, although the government have got this, you know, statutory duty, in some cases it's easy to meet a statutory duty just by kind of ticking a few boxes if nobody's really looking or scrutinising. And one commissioner can't scrutinise every single government decision. So this is about building, alliances of people out there who are going to help with that and also put pressure on the government to do better and to change. A really good example of that is that we worked with the Football Association of Wales. Now, football, soccer to you guys, is massive in Wales. Last year, Wales, for the first time in 64 years, got qualified for the World Cup, so this was like big news in Wales. The Football Association had a really progressive leader. We built networks with him, and he actually decided that he would work with us to deliver their first develop their first sustainability strategy called Wales Wellbeing in the World, with the aim of being the most sustainable football association in the world. And just a few days before the team went off to the World Cup, we launched this strategy with government. And this was the power of football, who every politician wanted to be part of because it was like the cool, thing that was happening at that time, saying, actually, we like the Future Generations Act and we have a role in taking this forward. And actually, that has a real role in pushing government to go further, because if they're being asked from the outside to do it, they're more likely to do it alongside being, criticised, sometimes supported or challenged by a commissioner. So for me, that network weaving is important on the outside to put that pressure in, and the same in terms of how this might get rolled out in other countries.
Hi, my name is Julia. I'm a senior studying natural resources here. I'm on a track to become an environmental educator, and I was just wondering, at the beginning of your speech, you mentioned how students or children could name more locals than 10 native tree species in their area. So I was just wondering if you have any environmental education initiatives and what role those might play in your vision for the solution for the future.
Yes, absolutely, and what a great career choice as well. So we've actually reformed the whole curriculum in Wales in line with the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act. If I'd had more time, there's probably many more examples that I could have given you. But essentially, it does a number of things. So we looked at what are the kind of skills that children and young people will need to develop, not just to get a job of the future, and we don't quite know what those jobs will be, but actually to have a life well lived. We formed the curriculum around 4 pillars, and all of our subject areas now have to be delivered through the lens of those 4 pillars. And those 4 pillars are creative and enterprising citizens, because creativity will be need to massively kind of ramp up in terms of its importance. Basically, robots are not creative. We want human skills, creativity, and so on. Ambitious and capable learners. This is about developing a love for learning, which often education systems knock out of kids. Rote learning and all of those sorts of things, and punitive approaches sometimes. So we want a system that develops that love for learning, because lifelong learning will have to become the norm. Healthy, active and confident learners, where we're placing physical and mental health as a key part of the curriculum. And then finally, which speaks mostly to the area that you're interested in, ethical and informed citizens. So our kids are educated from early years. We've looked at particularly Scandinavian models. They're educated in outdoor classrooms, connecting with nature. A little anecdote that I can, there's lots of things that are embedded in the new curriculum to enable that to happen. Sometimes I like stories. I was having a glass of wine with a few school mums a couple of months ago, and one of the school mums said her daughter, who was turning 9, had asked for a whittling knife for her birthday. Now, that to me, and then actually another mum piped up and said her daughter had asked for something as well. That is because our education system are immersing our kids in nature. Now, I'm not sure about the benefits of buying a whittling knife for a 9-year-old, maybe not. But that says to me how our kids are now reconnecting with nature. My eldest child is 24, my youngest is 9. The difference in what they're learning is just absolutely unbelievable, and it's one of the things that makes me most happy about the Future Generations Act.
Ms. Howe, in this age of south-north global migration, how do you reconcile the goal of promoting Welsh language and culture with the equally worthy concept of diversity and inclusiveness?
Yeah, great question. So the goals have to be looked at holistically. So no one goal should trump another goal. What the people of Wales said is that our culture, language and heritage are really important, but that should never disadvantage, if you like, particular minority groups. So some of the things that are happening as a result of that, we have a young people's organisation, Welsh-speaking organisation called the IRF. They have had a particular focus in engaging with Black, Asian, minority ethnic people. They actually became part of our nation of sanctuary. So refugees and asylum seekers are housed in Welsh-speaking IRF accommodation, which is kind of, promoting that kind of cohesive and inclusiveness. So I don't think the two things have to be mutually exclusive. You have to be careful about what that looks like, and you have to be purposeful in terms of meeting both goals. But I think we've got some really good examples in Wales of how that's happening.
Hi, I'm Michael Belowski with the Vermont Daily Chronicle. I want to get your take on some of the assertions by the author Eric Blair, pen name George Orwell. He wrote 1984. I assume most of you have read it, or at least understand the essence of it. One of his warnings in this book was that at any given point in time in history, the global elite's greatest concern is to control the middle and lower classes. And in the book, there's a perpetual war between three states that are secretly in cahoots with each other, but the public never knows that, or most of the public doesn't figure it out. But I guess the essence of my question is, how can you ensure myself and everyone here that the things you're proposing are not about just controlling us, how we live, what we can eat, what we can drive, where we can live, what we can say, free speech? Will our constitutions that created the foundation of this country and many others, and Constitution Day was this past Saturday, by the way, it was a national day. Can you guarantee that our rights will be protected? Well,
I don't think our rights are being protected at the moment. And when we talk about kind of freedom and control, what is freedom? Because not everyone has access to the same freedom as everyone else. If you're living in poverty, if you're not part of the global elite that has access to wealth, then you have many fewer freedoms than those people. I think the freedoms for future generations in terms of potentially not having a planet to live on, if this generation doesn't change its behaviour, I think, fundamentally undermines all aspects of freedom. So for me, freedom is about collective freedom. It's about being good ancestors. It's about not necessarily thinking only of ourselves and how things impact on ourselves. It's about thinking collectively about society, and it's about thinking about how our actions are going to affect other people in our society and indeed those people who are yet to be born.
Thank you so much. We're seeing some stirring because students are getting to their next class, but if you all could just thank Sophie for us, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
If you have any other burning questions, Sophie will be hanging out up front here for a few minutes. Thank you so much.